Now the hair grass will go and spread. So whenever you do these carpeting style tanks, when you first set them up, you're going to see a lot more of the substrate. The whole point is to do everything right with the CO2. You take a picture of it a month later, you see more coverage. It's kind of like putting plugs of grass into your yard. The next one we're going to use is Glosso. And Glosso is sold in pots, or if you ever need to do an aquascaping job, they're also sold on the mats. Now, on the mats, I like taking them off and actually planting them, because Glosso doesn't do well when it can't readily reach the substrate. And they put them on a coconut fiber husk pad with the metal on it, and that's great at putting it down, but if you really want to plant it, you have to separate it and plant the plants. What's nice as opposed to using it on the pots is that you'll get bigger plugs than you will out of the pot. This is where I'm going to need a volunteer. They can do this. I'll go have dinner. I'll come back when you're all done, okay? Now with the Glosso, easiest way is with tweezers, of course, and you kind of shake the substrate a little bit until it digs itself in. What you want to do is create a motion in which the substrate is falling on top and between the runners. If your substrate is too wet, it'll make it difficult because everything will stick to it. So it's important that your substrate stay dry in this phase until you need to. Also, Glosso does not go well with loaches. I don't know if I said that. Yeah, I kept, when we were moving my discus from the 90 to the 210, I waited a month and a half of growing out a perfect carpet of Glosso, only to be destroyed in a month's time by the loaches and the discus. And it is a very nice plant that I really like using it in a CO2 tank. But Lixia will consume huge amounts of CO2. Yeah, just you're gonna readjust your dosing, and that's where you're gonna be calibrating that tank and watching it, taking a weekend that you're off, and making sure you don't gas your fish, but you're going to have to increase your CO2 to the point of almost gassing your fish. Because otherwise you'll have algae, because the other plants in your scape will be deprived out of the CO2. Past couple of weeks of what we normally can get. And this is a hard to maintain plant, and I've kind of been nursing this plant at home, so I can add it in this. It's called Pogostemon helferi, or Pogo helferi. And right now it looks very delicate because I'm kind of squished up. It's going to turn and grow very nice. I'm going to use it as an excellent plant. It does not do well in a non high CO2 environment. It does need the CO2, but it's used a lot in the CO2 aquascapes. And like I said, that here comes in little cups. Have you ever seen Pogo or Pogostemon helferi? That's a plant that you may want to try it out if you have a CO2 setup. It does not do well in a non high CO2 environment. It does need the CO2, but it's used a lot in the CO2 aquascapes. And like I said, that comes in little cups. Have you ever seen Pogo or Pagostemon Mill Ferry? That's a plant that you may want to try it out if you have a CO2 setup. Homebrew method in which you mix water, baker's yeast, sugar, put it into a bottle, and put some hose, and nature does the rest. It actually starts fermenting, and you create bubbles of CO2.
And moonshine.
Huh?
And moonshine.
Yes. And then when you see those really crazy videos on YouTube, you understand that they drunk some of it. So, yes. Well, they got drunk by drinking some of it. And that works well for small tanks. You know, there's no on-off method to it. You can say yeast works day and night. Some people put like a spring clip on the hose, and they stop it every night and turn it again in the morning. Then there's manufacturers that make the small cylinders, disposable cylinders. Once again, they have no on-off method. All they have is a little valve, and you have to open and close it, you know, morning and night. The more advanced systems have something that's called a solenoid. Okay, and this is a typical CO2 regulator. It mounts on top of a cylinder. It has, most of the better ones have two gauges. One gauge tells you how much gas is in your tank. The other gauge tells you how much pressure you're putting into your tank, into the aquarium. They have something called a needle valve. And a needle valve is a very fine adjustment valve that allows you to meter how much CO2 is going into your tank. Because too much CO2 will gas your fish and you'll have dead fish. Okay? Just the right amount of CO2 will cause the plants to grow and produce oxygen and oxygenate your water. On a better system, not better, but, you know, fully developed system, they'll add something called a solenoid valve. And this is an electrically operated valve that works on a timer. So you set your timer when you want the CO2 to turn on and when you want it to turn off. Ideally, your CO2 should come on an hour to 2 hours before your lights go on, because you need to saturate the water with enough CO2 so when the lights go on, within 30 minutes, plants begin to produce photosynthesis. If you start the light process too early and there's not enough CO2, then you're not going to give enough time for the plants to reach their full capacity. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that when those plants are going at full capacity, there's enough CO2 and it's not limiting them. Because then you end up having is algae, which starts taking over or starts using available nutrients. On the same token, you want to turn off your CO2 an hour to 2 hours before your lights go off, because you want the plants to consume all that available CO2. Because what's going to happen when the plants go to sleep or they go during the night cycle, they release carbon dioxide into your water. And therefore, you don't want to create either too acidic condition for the fish or a situation that there's too much CO2 in the water, it's not good for the fish. So we always have to remember that we have fish in there, we have living, breathing animals, and we have to create a proper environment for them. Ideally, you should have two timers. One timer for your lights, one timer for your CO2. These timers are little mechanical timers, they're $9 and change, $10. They're well worth it. Some power strips have dual timers in them, and they work well for them. But the staggered time is the way to go. Another school of thought is doing with two lights, which I'm going to set up here, two lights. One of them, I'm gonna have to go in for a shorter period of time. I'm gonna do what they call the noon burst, which means when the sun is at its strongest, you run that for about 3 to 4 hours. So you have your primary light go on for 8 to 10 hours, and you have your secondary light that comes on from, for a 3-hour period. And some people work that. This is where it comes into the area that there's no exact science. You have to look at your tank. You have to see how your plants react. If you're doing well, if you're having algae under control, you keep doing more of what you're doing. If it's not working, you tweak and you adjust. And there's no hard book on the right way of doing it. There's different lights, different conditions. I may have this tank and the lights are set up at 10 inches, right? Your tank setup may be set up at 14 inches. You may need a longer burst time. Other people may not. And that's where this becomes now let's see what happens when you adjust and go on. So we have the gas comes out of the CO2 tank. Into silicone tubing. From there, it's going to go and do one of two things. You either have a built-in bubble counter right at the regulator with the needle valve here. And this is where you count how many bubbles per second you're feeding in. The smaller the tank, the less bubbles per second. That's why they put these fine adjustment tools. The bigger the tank, the more bubbles per second you're going to need. Okay? This is one type of bubble counter for putting CO2. The most basic one is a modified air stone. In other words, this is a glass cylinder covered in epoxy by a porous ceramic disc or square or whatever shape it is. When I say porous, it means that piece of ceramic allows gas to go through it. Much like a sand air stone, every of us have had one, except it creates much finer bubbles because CO2 doesn't readily mix into water. So we have to create the smallest, tiniest bubble so that it mixes with the water as well as it can. The other method is called a diffuser or a inline atomizer. And that's something for a canister filter. Works very similar, but it sits in line with your tubing, and it also forces CO2 into your stream of water. Lastly, are systems that have like a little power head that takes in water, and on the top it has a nozzle for the CO2, and it makes like a water spout, and it mixes in, churns the CO2 mechanically with the water, and then spits it out through the other power head. What works best? Whatever you can get it to grow your plants best. And different tanks are going to do different things. Currently commercially available, you have CO2 systems for up to about 90 gallons. Anything larger, you have to custom make it. And that's the challenge for all of us aquarists who's had big tanks into getting CO2 into their tanks. Anything larger than that requires some custom work and a combination of different technologies. But anything under that, off the shelf, different things will work. Lastly, is something called a drop checker. And Greg has a lot of experience with drop checkers and trying different technologies. He's a tinkerer. But in the most basic form, how you measure the concentration of CO2 in the tank is by measuring the change in pH. So pH is a measure of the amount of carbonates in the water. CO2 mixed into the water creates carbonic acid, which lowers the pH. These drop checkers come with a solution very similar to what you use to measure CO2. And you put in there, you put this, and this is exposed to air. This creates an air bubble. And this allows enough of the air to exchange to change the color. If it's blue, after an hour of the CO2 being on, it means you're not putting enough CO2 into the tank. If it's green, very variations of green, that'll tell you more or less how much CO2 that you're in the right range. If it's yellow, you're putting too much CO2 into your tank, which will cause certain types of algae, and you could also be, stressing your fish. Now, these drop checkers, it's important to check your water flow throughout different days during the week. Move it to different spots of your tank, because you want to make sure that all parts of your tank are getting the right amount of CO2. And that's where experimentation is going to come in, from where you put your CO2 diffuser, where the water flow is coming in from your tank, from your outflow, and that's something that there is no right or true formula. Every tank is different. Every aquascape is going to affect the water flow.